Now that you've seen how to get started with AngularJS, let's jump into some of the key players that are involved and some of the parts you need to know about. So when I first got started learning AngularJS, I was quite honestly pretty confused. There's a lot of different pieces. I like to think of them as Lego blocks, and I didn't understand how those Lego blocks fit together at all. And so I understood little pieces here or there and how they worked, but I didn't really see the big picture. So we're going to be looking at that. I think the key to learning AngularJS is first knowing what are the different parts that are available, how do those different parts fit together, and then how do I organize those parts to actually build a full application. Well, if you look at these parts from the big picture view, here's what it looks like. We have something called modules. Modules are just containers that components you build for your application, such as controllers, directives, services, factories, and others, have a way to be organized into one little container. And we're going to call that a module. Now you also have something called routes. This is how we determine which view gets loaded. A route is actually a path that you'll see up in the URL of your browser, and that route determines which view gets loaded. Now a view is obviously a web page, but it also needs some data and to have some logic. So on the UI side, we have what's called views. We've seen those a couple times up to this point already. And then in views, we can have directives, which enhance HTML, and we can have something called filters. Now filters we haven't covered yet, but we will. In a nutshell, what they do is provide some data filtering functionality, and they can also do simple things like uppercase data, lowercase data, and more. Now over on the logic data side of the equation, we have controllers. These are our brain for our views, you'll see. And then controllers can get data or perform business rules against factories or services. Now once a controller has data, we need to get that data into the view, and we do that using something called the scope. Now if you've ever used the term view model before, a view model is really the data for a view, then the view's model, or the view's data in other words, is really what we call in the Angular world the scope. Now, later we'll talk about why there's a dollar on front of this. It has nothing to do with, for instance, jQuery or Prototype or some of these other libraries that use dollar. It's an Angular-specific statement or term. It's really an object that we'll be learning about. And what it does is glues our UI side to our logic and data side. Now, if you look at this from the big picture, the module then is our container. Through a module, we can configure one or more routes. And a route is then going to marry a view with a controller. The thing that marries these two together, the view and the controller though, ultimately is the scope, the view's model. Now, a controller will typically get its data from a factory or service, and I have a star here because there's actually multiple options we'll talk about. And then we bind that data into the view using directives. And you've already seen one of those in ngModel. So a module, as I mentioned, is really just a container. You can think of it like a Tupperware container. You can put controllers and routes and directives and filters and all these different things that you see over here on the left into a module. From there, we can load data using something called a factory or service. So RESTful calls can be made from factories or services. We can actually share data between multiple controllers using these, custom business logic. All types of things that are reusable go in factories or services. Now these are singletons, and that's why once you create one of these, anything can share it, and they provide a great way to encapsulate reusable functionality. Now I like to think of these as a little Lego block, whereas the module is the Tupperware container, factories and services are the little Legos that go in the container. Now controllers are also a piece, a Lego block if you will, and controllers are going to interact with a factory or service typically and get some data. And then using the scope, they can then bind that data into the view using directives that are defined in the view. So a controller I think of as the brain for the data that we need to grab and then shove into the view that gets rendered in the browser. Well, think of that brain as the controller and think of the scope as the data for that view. In other words, the view's model, as I mentioned. So the scope you're going to see is very, very important to glue the view to the controller. So here's an example of what the scope kind of does. You can think of it literally as the glue. So when a controller gets some data, we're going to assign that data to some properties that are going to be in this scope object. Now the scope then will be associated with the view, and the view can then bind to those properties. So in the previous section of this, where we did a little hello world thing with ng model, we had a property called name, and name was actually added into the scope. Then when we did the data expression or data binding syntax, we were writing out the value of that particular name. And that's really what the scope does. Really important piece of this picture. And then views, of course, have directives and filters as mentioned. They're going to get data from the scope, or bind to the data in the scope, I should say. That scope gets its data from the controller, which might actually get its data from factories or services. So you can see that there's actually quite a bit to the big picture here, and quite a few different things that are going on. We also have routes as mentioned, and a route is just a path that defines which view and which controller to load. So for instance, we might have a path of /customers for a route, and that might trigger the customer's controller to load, get its data, assign it to the scope, and then the customers.html would be the view that actually renders that data using directives and filters and some of these other pieces. So here's a look at the big picture diagram one more time, and we're going to be seeing this throughout the course as I introduce the different modules. But we have a module at the top which acts as a container. It can then be used to configure routes. Routes associate a view with a controller, and then we do data binding between those two using the scope. A controller can get data from a factory or service, and then we do data binding, filtering, and things through directives and filters. So that wraps up this particular section, and I hope that starts to clarify in your mind some of the different Lego blocks and how they interact together. Now what we'll be doing in the next modules that will come up is drilling down into these individual pieces and showing more details about how to actually interact with them from a coding standpoint.